Hanging with Higgins, where author and former prosecutor John J. Higgins interviews his intriguing guests about their lives, knowledge, experiences, and projects. Explore, learn, and be entertained. Come, join us now. Good evening, and welcome to Hanging with Higgins. I'm your host, John J. Higgins. Tonight, I have a fellow author, Nina Bingham, who has written 5 books, 4 that are already available through Amazon.com. A trilogy of poetry entitled Living Out Loud, Outspoken Poems, Aphrodite's Cup, Passionate Poetry, and God on Fire, Spiritual Poetry. Additionally, she has written a book on recovery entitled Never Enough, a recovery workbook for addictions, obsessive-compulsive behaviors, and eating disorders. Her 5th book is due to be released in early 2015 and is entitled Once the Storm is Over, From Grieving to Healing After the Suicide of My Daughter. Briefly, her background is in psychology with an associate's degree from Santa Rosa Junior College, a Bachelor of Arts degree in applied psychology from City University of Seattle, Washington, a master's degree in mental health counseling from Capella University from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and she is also certified as a clinical hypnotherapist from America Pacific University in Hawaii. She has sites on Facebook and Twitter, and her main website is www.living-enlightened.com. Now I'd like to welcome you, Nina. How are you?
Hi, John. I'm fantastic. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Definitely my pleasure. Looking over your academic background, you certainly appear dedicated to the psychology field. Would you tell us why you decided to pursue a career in psychology?
Sure. So, John, my own family history of mental illness is what caused me to study psychology. In particular, my dad was an unmedicated, undiagnosed manic depressive, which today we call bipolar disorder. And I myself have struggled with my family depression gene since I was in my early 40s. And my daughter developed severe depression when she was just 11 years old. So in my 40s, I actually went back to college after I'd already had my associates in psychology to get my bachelor's because I wanted to understand mental health and I wanted to know how to fix it.
Well, I think that's my undergrad's in psychology as well, and I think there are many of us that went into the psychology field because of some sort of family history. We were trying to figure out what we were raised in and what was going on.
Absolutely, yes.
I mean, I don't know how your family was, but for my family, it was somebody had said this was very funny to me that I really enjoyed in the 1980s. It was a lot of people, looked like they were being raised in the Brady Bunch, but I felt like I was being raised in the Munsters, and that was really so true in my own life.
Yeah.
So it makes a lot of sense, for you to have done that.
Yes.
So why don't you give us some of your experience, because I obviously it's in counseling psychology that, your degree has come about, so I assume you've done a fair amount of counseling?
Yeah, so I've worked in private practice for the last 11 years as a life coach and a clinical hypnotherapist, and I also worked for the state in different psychiatric hospitals during those 11 years, so I've seen adults and children and even couples with a wide variety of mental health issues, but mainly, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, addictions, and then some couples counseling.
Well, when I was in undergrad, I did something that was kind of interesting. Well, I was a supervisor on a counseling hotline. So I was at Rutgers College at the time, and you would think that most of the calls we got were from students, but they really weren't. It was from the local community that they were really reaching out, and many of the people who called, well, we had what we maybe after 30 years I'm breaking some of the rules, but we weren't supposed to say this, but we had files on people who we called frequents, that they were calling us repeatedly. It was they were trying to use the counseling hotline as some kind of therapy.
Yes.
So we would only allow the student counselors, to talk to them maybe once a week or twice a week for, clear reasons.
Yes.
And although I do have a funny story in that. I had one guy who would call all the time, and I won't use his name. We'll call him Joe. Mm-hmm. So Joe would call, and he got me on the phone, the one day, and he said to me that he'd finally figured out how he was going to get a girlfriend. These were the days of the Moonies. Mm-hmm. What he was going to do was he was going to infiltrate Mooney headquarters in New York City, I guess, and he was going to try to save a young lady out of there who I guess he thought was going to become his girlfriend. So I was saying to him, my fear was when he was talking, he was going to kidnap somebody out of the Mooney organization.
Yeah.
Because I don't know this guy from Adam. I've never seen him. I've never seen him live. So, the conversation goes on. I said, well, I don't know if that's really such a great idea or whatever. So it went on for a while. So I said, he's saying, well, they're brainwashing all these young people and whatever. So I said to him, well, Joe, what happens if you go in and they brainwash you? And he goes, oh, my God. He goes, well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I will get a postcard, and I will send you a go code. And this code will tell you that you've got to come in and you've got to come save me. And so what I said to him, I said, Joe, I don't even know what you look like. But the other thing I did was I worked for field work. I took schizophrenics food shopping, which was quite an adventure. Mm-hmm. I will say that the thing that attracted them the most was anything in neon. And the one guy I had, he would fill the shopping cart with like Reynolds aluminum foil because it was in a flashy package. The sad thing about him though was that he stopped bathing. And life each week he was getting a little riper. Mm-hmm. And finally what happened, they moved him back into the more of an institutional setting, and he tried to set soap on fire. So I don't know what his, decompensation process was, but, that thing was just really sad. And,
wow.
I think community-based programs are really a great idea, but you really have to have close monitoring on them. So.
Yes.
Yeah,
well,
you do.
You had some interesting stories there.
I've always got interesting stories. Sometimes I wonder sometimes.
I've got a similar story, John, that I've got to tell you. One time I was working in a community-based, sort of outpatient psychiatric home, and I led a little group just to the corner market, the convenience store, and I kind of had to chuckle when one of the clients had a porn magazine in one hand and an I Love Jesus ball cap in the other, and bought them at the same time.
Well, he had, it's like you have what's the medieval version of the good and evil angels. You have the one good angel whispering in the left ear and the bad angel whispering in the right, or vice versa.
I think that's it. Yeah.
But it is a hard field, to work in.
Yes.
Because if you're good at it, as far as I'm concerned, you kind of experience the emotions that the person you're counseling is describing.
Yes, I think you're right.
So how do you deal with that part in your own, in your own life?
Well, I think that's something that you develop the longer you work in mental health. If you don't develop a thick skin, and if you don't develop those boundaries with your clients, then you're not really in a position to help them after a while. If you lose that objectivity, then you're really not as much help as you could be if, you're not as involved. So I think I kind of saw early on that it was actually an advantage to the client if I would keep a healthy boundary between us. So, but I think that's something that you have to learn, as you go on in mental health.
Well, I know some people, I've really don't know how that all works, because I was going to go into clinical psychology, but I had taken a placement at the governor's office in my senior year of college, and then I went off, and the boss I had talked me out of clinical psych school and talked me into law school, which I don't know that was up or down, but for whatever reason my career went in a whole other path. But I know a lot of therapists, they have therapists for themselves or whatever, where they discuss what's going on in that.
Yes. Yeah, and that's really important too. You know, you've touched on it in the introduction, but I've got a new book coming out early 2015, and it's the autobiography of my life and my own struggle with mental illness, my family's history with it, and then, you know, it falling on my daughter and her taking her life at the age of 15 a year and a half ago. So at that point, John, I needed somebody to talk to too, you know. I think it's important that everybody has a sounding board, and I have a wonderful friends and family, a wonderful support network, but I also needed someone at that point professionally who was objective enough to be able to sort of, you know, field all the guilt and blame that I was putting on myself, and to help me heal. So I actually went to a psychotherapist who did some psychotherapy with me, and I think unless I'd had that little push in the right direction, I might still be struggling.
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, when I first was introduced to you, I guess we met on Twitter or whatever, and you know, and and then with some of the stuff of, you know, learning more about you, I mean, that is really a very hard thing to get over. Yes. You know, yes. I mean, I found my sister dead in bed with her 4-year-old trying to keep her body warm about 10 years ago, but it was an accidental overdose. She had failed back surgeries, and the medication, you know, if you know anything about substance abuse and all those kinds of things, is that your body's tolerance increases, and then it gets to the point that the tolerance is beyond the fatal dosage level.
Yeah.
And unfortunately for her, she was not only taking the morphine derivatives, but they put her on methadone as well. And it's my belief that methadone doesn't leave at the same rate that the other ones do. Mm-hmm. And she was actually not even taking the full dosage of what she was supposed to be taking, and it just got her. But oh my God, what a terrible, you know, thing to do. And I mean, that was accidental. I mean, and you know, trying to make sense out of all of that had to be really difficult. Mm-hmm. So, you know, my heart really goes out to you.
Thank you, John.
And, you know, like we discussed on the phone a little bit before we've done this, is that, you know, I think today, you know, this whole suicidal, I don't know, it's almost like an epidemic in society, as you had said to me.
Yes.
You know, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add that, so in June of 2013, when my teen daughter committed suicide, I struggled with severe depression at that point. It just, you know, came on like gangbusters again. And as a way to cope and heal through that tragedy, my psychologist said, well, Nina, you know, what is it that you can do to express all of this guilt and pain you're feeling? And I said, well, you know, I'm a writer. And he said, well, why don't you just begin to write about it? And so as a way to cope and heal, I just began to write my story, my life story, and just externalizing it, John, just getting the pain out. I mean, pain can be like poison in your system if you can't somehow express it. And so just the writing of it was so cathartic for me. And I believe that this book has really saved my life in a lot of ways.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, that's an important thing to do. I mean, listen, the Freudian and whatever his derivative stuff has been the talking cure. Yes. So, yes. You know, I think expressing what's going on within us, yes. I know for myself in my personal life is that when I have to say it or write it down, it's no longer swimming in my mind.
Right.
You know, Freud's got a lot of other problems, but I think his genius was that, you know, first of all, describing the unconscious, which nobody had really done prior to him. Mm-hmm. But the other part was that there is no time in the unconscious. Mm-hmm. So all things can coexist at the same time whether they're logically inconsistent or not.
Yes.
And when you have to talk about them or write them down, it kind of solidifies it so you can see exactly what it is that's going on.
Yes.
Basically what I call the hidden tapes, the tapes that run all the time that you don't hear, but they're pretty loud, you know.
Yes.
And so that would be a very important piece to do. So how long did it take you to write this book?
It really took about a year, maybe 14 months, so just a little bit over a year. And honestly, it's been a year and a half now, so a little over that time that I've written the book. And I would say, John, that at this point, a year and a half later, I'm just now, I think, really fully recovered. I think that one misconception about grieving that I do address in the book is that we kind of think that grieving works in, sort of a step process, because that's originally what we were taught in psychology, is that first, you go through the first step of grief, which is denying that it's true, and then you work from denial into, another step and another step. But it's not that linear. It's that sometimes you're in denial, and in other times you're in anger. And other times you're bargaining with God and those other people around you. And then sometimes you'll go back to the anger. And so grief is a process that can last, honestly, for me, I've just come to the point where I've accepted it's going to be something that I deal with for the rest of my life. But I do want to add, though, that I think we can feel grief, but we don't have to camp there. In other words, I don't have to let grief control the rest of my life.
Right. Well, I feel like I'm talking to myself because I've said that for a long time. Kubler-Ross, came up with that,
yes.
The 5 stages of grief, and that, I think that's really helpful on some level.
Yes.
But I don't think it was ever really clear that it is not linear,
yes.
and it fluctuates back and forth.
Yes.
And sometimes people in grief think that they're not doing something right because they're jumping back into another stage. But it's really a very difficult thing to deal with, and it takes its own course. So, that's always the problem with labeling things. I in many things, a lot of studies will look at whatever happened, and they'll find the commonalities in it and then make conclusions from the commonalities, when in reality it's not watching it how it really progresses.
Yes.
And, to have, somebody die before their time, it's got its own psychological, pain, and then to think of somebody harming themselves and doing that, it's even worse. Now, do you go through any kind of warning signs and that type of thing in your book? I don't really go into exploring suicide as a topic so much as this is an autobiography of mental illness. Really, it's a brief picture of what it looks like in a family to have mental illness run rampant and how it impacts everybody, and especially how suicide impacts the survivors. That's really what this book is about, and I wrote it for, is to help suicide survivors, but really, John, also to reach out to teens who are depressed and who are thinking of suicide. I think if they read this book, they'll come to appreciate very quickly, if they were to make that decision, what kind of impact would it have. I think they'll see immediately what kind of impact it would have. Right. Well, I know I've heard the phrase that, suicide is a, permanent solution to a temporary problem.
Yes.
And, in adolescence, I have to tell you, and I've said this for many years, is I don't know how any of us survive adolescence. It is just a crazy time between, the hormones kicking in, and you've got a child's mind and what's becoming an adult body.
Yes.
And, today, I was at the, I went into my teenage years at the late 60s, early 70s, and there was a lot of things changing at the time, but nowhere's near what there is today. You don't have access, to the entire world in your living room.
Exactly. Yes.
And then there's so many mixed messages that keep coming and
Yes.
trying to filter them through. It's like Google. You research a term, you'll get 10,000 sites, but you got to know which site to take more serious than the other.
Yeah.
And as a child doing that, I don't know how. I don't even know how you explain that kind of system to somebody at that age.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, John, because I do believe that kids in this generation are faced with an incredible amount of information, and some good and some not so good. But I do tell a story in my book, actually, about how my daughter Mariah, at just a very young age, I let her have access to the computer just to play some video games, and I had it in my room, and I only let her on it when I was in there. So you would think that would be pretty safe, but she got herself onto the wrong sort of adult thing, and a predator got a hold of her telephone number. And she happened to have a cell phone because I gave it to her so she could stay safe after school until I got home from work. And she gave out the cell phone number to this predator. And I tell the story of that in my book because she had just lost her father. Her father just died. And she was reaching out for a male figure, and guess who reached back? A predator.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah. So it's very prevalent. This happens a lot.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, this is I know from being in law enforcement, that was one of the biggest. We have our state police and the FBI have a joint lab, and I worked on some pretty serious homicides. And I remember, having one of their technicians that had to search through the one woman. She had, went and bought a gun, and everything was on the computer, and the woman was doing the searches for us. And she said, "Oh, thank God, you don't know how much better this is to work on this." She goes, "I watch child porn like 7 hours, every day, with all of that's going on." And, the predators are out there in innumerable ways.
Yeah.
And some of them act as though they're children.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to distinguish. I don't even know whether these safety mechanisms they're putting on websites are enough to, screen out these people.
I don't think they are, John. It's been my experience that, any 12 or 13-year-old girl who is curious, or boy who's curious about, their early sexuality, if they go on to any kind of adult chat rooms, they're sure to meet up with people like this. That's where they go.
Yeah. And then trying to monitor what a kid is doing. I mean, that's a whole other range of problems, because how would you even know half the time,
right,
unless you're really seeing all of the text messages that go back and forth, or however they communicate. Now they have, is it Snapchat or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
They have one that the messages go through, and then they delete themselves in a short period of time.
Yes.
So you wouldn't even have a trail to follow up on.
Yeah. So the generation today is dealing with a bombardment of ways to connect with people, and some of those people, are looking to take advantage of them.
Right. Well, I've also seen, you just look at the news. I mean, we have all these, these teachers getting involved sexually with their,
yes,
their students. I
yeah.
mean, we have another couple of cases in New Jersey that it came up, and I see in Arkansas there's another set, and it just wasn't the male teacher on the female student. Now it's I think that always went on. It was just that it wasn't really considered to be a crime.
Right.
A lot of times crimes, I don't know. We, by letter of the law, it may be a crime, but there's almost a blind eye that has gone to a lot of things over the years. And now there's been a much more awareness of what's going on.
Right.
So
and when that happened to my daughter, the interesting thing was I did call the police right away as I got on the phone with the predator, and I let him know that I knew I had his phone number. I knew what he was up to. He hung up as soon as he heard me, and I called the police with his telephone number, and I said, "Can you guys do anything about this?" And they said, "Unless he has crossed the line and actually set up a meeting with her, then he's done nothing wrong." So unless they've actually set up a meeting, as I understood it, that's what they told me, that predators are allowed to talk to underage kids, and they have not broken the law unless they take that next step and actually set up a meeting.
Right. Well, I never did those cases, so I don't, I don't know the statute well enough to get to that point. I know we had a problem with harassment statutes here. Was that when somebody be harassing somebody with making phone calls to them, there's a variety of ways you can harass somebody, but to try to get the phone records, we were not able to, because our wiretap statutes really deal with felonies, and all of that level of crime was considered like a misdemeanor, or we call them disorderly persons here. So we couldn't get a court order to get the phone records to track it back. Hopefully they've changed that since I've retired, but sometimes that's a problem in law enforcement. Sometimes you're between two rocks. You can't move far enough to get something resolved until something really bad happens.
Right.
And I know the other thing that seems to have appeared to me over the last few years with the computers and the chat rooms and whatever is all the bullying that starts to go on.
Yes.
And some of these kids are on there and they're being ganged up on by the bully in the classroom or whatever.
Yes. And many of these kids who are being bullied feel that they just have to resort to suicide because it's so devastating to them. And maybe they feel like they can't talk to their teacher about it, because if the teacher mentioned it to the group of people or the people that are targeting them, then they're going to be the one that snitched. And so they don't want to do that. And then, but they may not feel like they can tell their parents, because then they think, well, mom or dad's going to overreact and make it worse for me at school. And so they get to a place where they feel like they can't talk to anybody about these things. And that's when they resort to suicide.
Yeah. Well, I remember in the 80s when I was really working on changing the whole substance abuse system for the governor back in those days. And I worked for an attorney general who was probably the smartest man I've ever met in my life. That, it was commonsensical. Sometimes you meet geniuses that, they talk about yaks in Yemen, but, he had a practicality about him. And he turned to me at one point, because we had this full-scale plan, and from prevention to treatment and whatever. And he said to me, John, if there was one thing here you could do, what would you do? And I said, I would put student assistance counselors in the schools, because you really needed somebody in that school system that a child could go and talk to and feel safe. The anti-drug curriculums, if the teacher likes it, it'll have some effect. But a lot of the teachers, particularly then, it was like they thought it was nonsense. And that gets communicated across. And the kids that are in these disenfranchised homes, or where they really don't have an adult to talk to, they really need to develop a level of trust with somebody in the school.
Yes. And
you can't count on that in a few weeks. That whoever that person has got to be there for a good portion of whatever the school year is, interacting with them.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the schools have counselors, and I certainly have something to say about this, because an opinion about this, because the school does have a counselor, but that school counselor has so many people in their caseload. It's incredible. I mean, the high school that my daughter went to was over 700 children, almost 800 kids, and they had just several counselors for all those problems. I mean, it's absolutely impossible for those school counselors to be able to effectively help the kids who really need the help. So do we need more people listening at the high school level? Absolutely. Absolutely we do.
Well, actually, I think it's got to go earlier than that, because the middle school sometimes is where all this stuff starts.
Yes. And,
I mean, it's just not a 14-year-old, because everybody's being exposed to more and more, at earlier and earlier ages.
Yes.
And then, when we're, I mean, that's one of my pet peeves about what's been going on in New Jersey, is that, somehow all the public workers are, they're all fat and lazy, and the teachers are drug mules and whatever, coming from a guy who's a governor, which I've worked for governors. I just can't imagine those words coming off of any other governor I ever worked for. And, at the end of the day, these people have very difficult jobs. They're not easy jobs. No. You've got to be on all day long, and you're dealing with, kids who come from a variety of backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'll hear, well, that the parents at home should be, taking care of this and whatever. But with the economy, pretty much still not right at all. Mm-hmm. Both parents are working. They're worn out, mm-hmm. and, they're not getting home until later in the day. Mm-hmm. And so now, you've got to try to deal with a child with their problems, mm-hmm. which, and how many adults, parents or not, are really in touch with, what's going on with the kid. It's like kid stuff to them. Mm-hmm. So,
and a lot of times, as you well know, teens are not real keen on opening up to the parents anyway. So, right. Even with my teen, I mean, I'm a therapist, and I was always asking her, tell me about your day, tell me about the problems that are going on, always trying to dig out information. And just because she was in the teen years, she resented, having right. to talk to me. So this is a very common dilemma for parents. Right. One thing I wanted to mention, John, is I do have a campaign going on online. If people are interested in donating a little bit of money so that suicide survivors and teens who are struggling with depression can get a copy of this book for free, they can go and donate a little bit of money. Even a $10 donation would buy one of these teenagers a book. And so my vision is to give copies of my book free of charge to those people who need it and can't afford it. So to suicide survivors and then teens struggling with depression. So that's called the Hold On to Hope campaign, where you can go and pre-order my new book and also at that same time make a donation. And all those funds raised are going to be used to provide my book free of charge to those people. So you can find that on my website.
Uh-huh. I think that's a really good idea. At some point, I may even talk to you, but maybe one of the things I got good at, part of my assignments was to raise money for, we had an anti-crime foundation. It was part of the Attorney General's office, which was just filled with conflict from the get-go because we were the head of law enforcement. But, sometimes you can get money from corporations that, mm-hmm. Have some kind of vested interest in kind of doing this mm-hmm. that, may also be able to help you, get that accomplished.
Okay. Let me mention one more thing then, John, because, excuse me, I do have another website where it's called www.oncetheStormIsOver.com, which is the name of the book. But this is a website that specifically I built for businesses or corporations where you can actually place an ad in this new book, and so become a sponsor. And it be read by thousands of people all over the world. And so if a business wants to go to this website, all the details are there. But it's a very cool way for businesses to be remembered by readers for, really caring about this issue. Yes.
Well, when I did, as I said, since I had inherent conflicts in raising money out of a law enforcement mm-hmm. agency, what I would do is I actually had, it was Hoffman LaRoche actually did it for me, was that they printed up 60,000 of these drug-free school zone posters I designed. Mm-hmm. They went into every single classroom in the state. Mm-hmm. And I had one of the major realtors here in New Jersey, Weichert, that printed up a brochure that went home to the parents. It was 1.5 million, I think, that we took and we distributed. But, of course, they were able to put their name on it and all of those things. Mm-hmm. And it saved me the grief of having money coming in. Because now it wasn't money. I gave them, back in those days, mechanicals. Mm-hmm. And they actually printed the stuff up themselves. So that was a way to get around that. Mm-hmm. But I think that that's really a very good kind of approach to do. Mm-hmm. So I'll make sure at the end of this show that I build a video kind of thing at the end so that when it's archived, people will be able to see your website information right up in front of them.
Oh, fantastic. Great.
Yeah, so we try to make that work.
Great.
And one of the other things I wanted to ask you about, because it's always fascinated me, was the whole concept of hypnotherapy.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So maybe you could explain some of how that works.
Sure. So hypnosis, I think, is a fascinating topic. I originally went to a hypnotherapist because I needed to stop smoking, John. I'd smoked for 10 years, and this was when I was in my early 30s. And I was extremely skeptical when I went. I just thought it was a bunch of mumbo jumbo. And I only went because I had been diagnosed with a lump on my thyroid. And at the time, they thought it was cancer. So I thought, okay, this is it. There's no more choice. I've got to stop the smoking. And a friend said, well, why don't you try hypnosis? Because I tried everything and nothing worked. And I said, well, that's just ridiculous stuff. That doesn't, there's no, what's the scientific backing to that? And she said, well, as I understand it, Sigmund Freud was a hypnotherapist before he became a psychoanalyst. Well, that got my ear, because I respect Freud. So I thought, well, okay, if it's good enough for Freud, it's good enough for me. So I went to hypnosis, and after the second appointment, I kicked the habit completely. So for me, that was like a miracle, to stop smoking after 10 years. So I enrolled in the clinical hypnotherapy program and became certified. And then I decided I wanted to be a hypnotherapist. So I was in marketing before that. I jumped out of marketing and into alternative healthcare. And I joined an integrated medical clinic where I got to practice alongside of alternative healthcare practitioners. And I learned a lot from them, and it was just a very exciting time for me.
So when you do this as part of your practice, how do you conduct this?
Well, I see mostly folks for hypnosis usually come for the same things. They come for weight loss, or they come to stop smoking, or they come for anxiety issues, because hypnosis is fantastic for anxiety. And then I have some people who, came for eating disorders and addictions as well. So I worked on all of those issues with people.
Okay. I mean, where I guess my basic exposure, of course, having the background in psychology, I mean, of course, what was it? Mesmer was the first guy who was, I guess, working into that field, and that's where that term mesmerize comes from, which I always love, like the word root or where it comes from.
Yes.
But as I've always been fascinated with the idea of getting the mind focused in a way that it would be able to do that, because I really think the human mind is like this incredible machine or whatever, that it can do so many different things. And I also, I guess, maybe like the idea that you could have control over somebody, and some of my more crazy kind of thoughts. But when I was in law school, I had my study partner. She was really very conservative. She was a school teacher. Her dad had been a colonel or a lieutenant colonel, whatever, in the Air Force, and she was like an Army brat or whatever. And if you talk to her, she was very conservative. But I think for Christmas that year, she had given me a book by Brian Weiss. It was called Many Lives, Many Masters. And, of course, I laughed when I first got the title, because I thought it was some kind of BDSM kind of thing, I don't know, masters and whatever. But when I was reading it, I was really fascinated with Brian Weiss, who was the psychiatrist that, he had worked at a major hospital. And the book basically describes he has a client called Catherine that, for whatever reason, she can't swallow pills. So in desperation, he thought that he would hypnotize her and, either get her to swallow pills or to help her with her mental issues at the time. And she started going into these past lives, which, at first, you're going, well, I don't know, that could be imagination or whatever. But it seemed pretty convincing. Weiss seemed to have great credentials. It was written, it wasn't Looney Tunes kind of thing. So a number of years later, actually maybe 10 or 12 years ago, I went into New York City. There's this place, the Omega Institute, that has a lot of alternate kind of medicine, yoga, that kind of stuff. And he was doing a seminar on this past life regression. And, I had gone in and I met him, when I was part of that. And he basically did like a group hypnosis on all of us. And, I had some things that popped up. And then it dawned on me, I've had some memories that I had asked my mother about, who was the guy with the boat? And why were we going to this law office with this lawyer who had like this portico porch, because we were sitting up on the top? She goes, we never went to any of those places. And to be honest with you, there is true as though it happened 3 days ago in my memory pattern. And so I thought that was pretty fascinating. Mm-hmm. So have you done any of that kind of work?
Because I'm more of a clinician, I haven't done a ton of it, but I facilitated past life regressions maybe about 20 times or so during my career. And I've got a favorite story actually about that, of a very skeptical friend who was completely against it. He said it was against his religion, this whole idea of hypnosis, and he thought it was just ridiculous. Anyway, so we had a nice friendship, and he would keep bringing hypnosis up because, he knew that's what I did. And we would kind of banter back and forth good-naturedly about it, And then finally one day he just kind of surprised me and he said, okay, let's do it. And I said, let's do what? And he said, well, I've been putting this off long enough. He said, I want to see if this is real or not, this whole past life thing you've been telling me about. I said, right. Really? You really want to do this? I just couldn't believe it, because he was so against it. And he said, let's give it a shot. He said, I know nothing's going to happen. He goes, but I have to know whether, this is true or not for myself.
Right.
So I said, okay, so I explained how it works, that he would just need to sort of relax and that I would just step him through it and that I wasn't going to feed him any answers or anything like that, and that I was actually going to tape record it so that if he did say anything, we could just simply play it back and he could hear it for himself. And one of the odd things about hypnosis is that after you're done with your session, I would say you forget about 90% of what you said, which amnesia happens, which there hasn't been a ton of research done on hypnosis, which there's been some done, but what we still don't understand why that amnesia occurs completely. But at any rate, I prepared him for that. I said, so you may not remember everything, but I'll record it. So he laid down and I just, started doing what's called progressive relaxation, where we, just relax you from the top of your head to the tip of your toes. It's just really pleasurable, just relaxing yourself. And this nice music is playing and I've got the recorder going. And even before I began talking, sort of from the script, from the past life regression script that I used and had written, he just starts telling me about the time that he's a little boy and he's hiding underneath the dock and, and all this stuff. And I thought, I wasn't sure if he was talking about his present life or if he was actually had just kind of spontaneously gone into a past life, because I hadn't even gotten a chance to say my script. And so I just let him continue. And from there, he recollected 5 different lives that he'd lived. Wow. And at the end of it, I was just kind of amazed, I mean, I'd seen this happen before with other clients, but he was so staunchly against it that I would kind of figured nothing was going to happen. Anyway, and so when he came up out of it, I was just had my mouth hanging open, and I said, well, what do you remember about that? Because you had a lot to say. He talked for almost 2 hours.
Wow.
I ran out of tape. And so he said, well, I kind of remember something about a kid under a dock. And I said, well, that's where you started. I said, but you've actually recollected 5 different lives. And he said, no. I said, no, I swear it's all here. I said, don't believe me. Listen to the tape. You be the judge. So we played the tape back for him, and he just had tears coming down. He said, Nina, I don't remember saying any of this. He said, but as I listened to it, he said, it all makes sense to me. Because the things that the different lives he was recollecting, John, somehow they sort of impacted the current life he had and had actually caused some of the problems that he had and some of the hang-ups that he had. So it was a very moving experience for him. And, then he became a supporter, of past life regression. Wow.
Well, it's funny how the way you describe that here's the guy who doesn't want to do it, and it's almost like it's ready to burst out of him. So as soon as he's given the opportunity, to open up that part of his mind, all of a sudden it comes flowing.
Yeah. And I have to believe that part of his mind, that unconscious subconscious part, had been sort of pushing his conscious mind to do this, or he wouldn't have kept asking me, for the weeks and months that we talked about it, he wouldn't have been trying to figure it out so hard. People aren't usually that interested in it. So I think that there was definitely a reason why his subconscious needed that information to come to the surface.
Right. It's like the reluctant suitor. I mean, that's well. The other fascinating thing with Dr. Weiss when he was up there, he probably described it in another book. I'm not sure if he does or he doesn't because he has multiple books out. Was that he was describing this one woman that he had taken into past lives, and she described her life as living in Ireland, I guess in the 1900s, maybe the early 1930s, when she passed away. And she had 7 or 8 kids. So he goes to this talk show where they go and they track down the kids that she described. And everything lined up, which is, just kind of amazing to me.
And as I recall from Dr. Weiss's book, because I read it too, I read it several times over because it is an amazing book. And correct me if I'm wrong, because it's been a while since I read it, but it seems to me that it was either that person or there was another person that research has been done on, but they recollected being able to speak some kind of Irish dialect or Celtic dialect that had come from eons ago that no one even spoke anymore, and the person was actually speaking in it, and he recorded it, and then he went to a colleague who worked at a university, and he said, "Can you tell me what language this is?" And then the colleague said, "I don't have any idea." And when it did research, it came back with the answer of, well, that's actually a Celtic, or I think it was an Irish, ancient dialect of a language that this person was speaking.
Right. And I mean, that stuff is what really always fascinates me, how that all, falls into place. And certainly seems to confirm that, the body we're in right now is really nothing more than like a suit.
Yes.
And that there's some kind of collective, part of us that just kind of goes from body to body and, just doesn't disappear.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, some of the religions touch on that, but,
Well,
I don't think they ever get to the depth.
Well, the Eastern religions believe that, Hinduism believes it, Buddhism believes it. So the Eastern religions, this is a fundamental belief that they have. Here in the West, we have Christianity and Catholicism and not so much those Eastern beliefs. But if you lived in the East and talked about reincarnation or past lives to anybody, they would look at you like, yeah, so what? Instead of being here in the West where if you, bring up that kind of topic, sometimes people look at you like you got crabs crawling out of your ears.
Absolutely. Well, I guess when I was reading some of the reincarnation kind of thing, they were also talking about, if you really think about it, Christianity is basically based on resurrection, right?
Yes.
Which, it's bizarre that we think that, that's so counter to what the religion is when, Christ is reborn and, then kind of goes on.
Yeah.
And, it's I always get fascinated where you have that kind of contradiction that's going on in an established kind of or organized religion.
Well, I think the Gnostic Christianity was Christianity before Constantine, who cut the Bible down to the canons that they are now. And so what he cut out, was the Gnostic Christians' belief, which had included two things that the current Bible doesn't include. It included belief in a mother god figure. And that it also believed in reincarnation. So that actually was part of the original Bible that got cut with the Constantine, the Christian Constantine, and so he canonized the Bible and cut those things out. But for thousands of years, Gnosticism was Christianity.
Right. Well, that's also. I'm sure you haven't read my books, but I mean, I got into the angels because I knew there was a story. I couldn't find it written anywhere. And then I started researching all in the Genesis type time period. And so many books and myths and whatever had been removed that there's hints of it in Genesis, but it's never explained. And you read it and you go, well, that really doesn't make a lot of sense for example, the Nephilim are supposedly these terrible creatures that, are terrible on the earth, but the Bible then, after it mentions them, says that they were the heroes of old and the men of renown. And it's like, well, how does that all fit together with what else they've described?
Yeah.
And then when you get into the more New Testament stuff with Constantine, I mean, they were removing, anything that I guess Mary Magdalene had said, because now we're finding, the Gospel of Mary, and, some of the other ones, I guess the Book of Thomas and Judas, and, if it didn't fit into exactly what they were trying to, I guess, put forth into the world, that, it had to be removed, or it was blasphemous or whatever.
Yes.
I just saw a special on, I don't know, I watch a lot of Discovery and History Channel and whatever, and it was talking about the discovery of these missing books, I guess by, there were two sisters, I think, that were in Egypt about 100 years ago, maybe more, in the late 1880s or whatever, and they had been discovering these manuscripts in Egypt that had these other books in there. And, to me, I think that any religion or belief system should be rich enough and wide enough that it can absorb all of these things. It's not that you have to foreclose things because it doesn't fit what your viewpoint is.
Yeah, the Bible that we have today is a very different Bible than the Bible that was even with Christ. Christ had the Gnostic Bible. That's his Bible, was the Gnostic Bible. And then, of course, it all got changed after Christ died and rose and all that stuff. So, yeah, it's a very different Bible than how it started out.
Well, I had a former wife, I've had a few, who was very, very religious, but of course, hated the Catholics. And it was that, the King James version of the Bible was the true and actual Word of God. And it would be like, well, first of all, you don't have your Bible without the Catholics. So they didn't get the original source material either. And it's translated in English, which obviously loses a lot of stuff. And my problem always has been is that I don't think that, my version of who the Almighty is confined into a 4-inch thick book. Yeah. So,
well, I hope it's not, John.
Yeah. Well,
I hope it's not just that small.
Yeah, exactly. It's like I just can't see beating people over the head with those kinds of things. But everybody's got their own belief, and I kind of let people find their own way, whatever that may be. Yeah. So, but it is really an interesting topic, and it's the one that's always fascinated me.
Yeah, it is. So. It is interesting. You know who writes a lot about that, and I'm sure you've read her material, is psychic Sylvia Browne, because she was a Gnostic Christian, and so that's really where I learned about Gnostic Christianity. I was raised a Christian, John. I went to church 3 times a week until I was 18 years old. I mean, I had to be in the front row. I sang in the choir. I led worship for the ladies' retreats. I led worship in front of the church. I played the guitar and I sang. So I am steeped in the Christian religion. I mean, I was raised, my stepdad is a pastor, and he has a master's in divinity. And then my mom went to Bible school. So I was raised to believe that the Bible, the books of the Bible that we have now are, the Word of God, and that you don't question it. But, as I got older, I began to think, maybe the concept that we have of God is too small. Maybe we're just kind of, based on the Bible, making God into our own image instead of us being made after the image of God, which is what the Bible says. So I just began to have a sense that God was actually much bigger and much more inclusive than the Bible that I was taught about. And so I began a study of world religion and went to college and actually took several classes in world religion. And boy, I began to find out there are all kinds of traditions out there that honor the sacred and that are beautiful traditions. But, they don't follow the strict rules of the Bible. Right.
Well, the one character is in the time of Jesus who I think I have the most sympathy for is Mary, his mother. What a terrible, what a terrible thing to have witnessed. I don't know if you ever saw that movie, The Passion of the Christ, that Mel Gibson had done. All I know is when I was done with that movie, I was furious, and I was mad that any God could allow that to happen to anybody, but that's another story.
Yeah.
But to have been the mother, to have witnessed that kind of thing would have been absolutely terrible. And the Catholics kind of canonized her or sanctified her, but I still think from a human perspective that had to be a terrible thing to have lived through.
Yeah. And as you're talking about Mary, John, and not that I'm not that I'm deserving of any reverence, but as I'm sitting here listening to you describing Mary and what she went through, losing her son, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, wow, in a way it's similar to lose a child. It doesn't matter if that child's older. It doesn't matter what age you lose someone at. Grief's all the same. Grief's all the same, One of the things that you mentioned, and I kind of wanted to rewind to, was you said something about, I don't know if it was a question you asked, but maybe it was just something you said, but you said, what would you sort of say to someone who, had gone through a grief experience like this? I don't know exactly how you put it, but the one thing that I would say is if you're a person who's lost someone, or if you're just a person who's worried about someone who is depressed, maybe it's a teenager or someone older, I would say the things I would do differently today would be to get them talking and keep them talking. Keep them talking. I think when we get depressed, we want to isolate, and we've all been depressed. Like we've all had moments of depression where we were feeling hopeless and helpless. But when a person gets severely depressed, they want to isolate. And I think the thing I would do differently today that I didn't do enough of with my daughter is I would insist that she engage with me more. In other words, don't be afraid of their rejection and their anger, because when a person is suffering with depression or actually any mental illness, you're going to find that oftentimes they project their anger onto you and reject you and try to push you away. And so a lot of that stuff gets directed at you, especially if you're a parent of a teenager. Right. And I think the thing that happened to me, John, is I allowed myself to get intimidated. And if I had it to do differently, that's what I would do differently. I would be much more assertive today, and I would get her talking about how it felt for her to be depressed and, what thoughts she was telling herself. Just asking the person, talk to me about what are your thoughts saying? Like, what are your thoughts telling you? Right. And just trying to, it feels intrusive as a parent. You're going to feel intrusive. But, as I look back on it, oh gosh, I wish I had been much more assertive with her. I was afraid to lose her love. I was afraid of her anger, because we'd been through so many fights about her going to counselors and taking medication. And the other thing I would say is it's really important to provide an environment where that person feels safe in telling you their worst thoughts. So I would say pester them, don't lecture them, but just try your very best to build a bridge to them. And that's really all you can do. I mean, as a parent of a teen, that's all you can do is keep throwing it out there and hope that they pick it up. There's going to be some kids that don't, John. There's going to be some kids like mine that are severely depressed. And my daughter's story is that she went off her medication without telling anyone for 5 days. And after that 5 days, she had so many suicidal thoughts, and she never told a single soul. And she acted on it because she stopped taking her medicine. So there are going to be some suicides, John, that you can't stop. If that person is intent on taking their lives, they may find a way to do it, and especially if they stop their medication.
Yes.
But as
we're almost out of time, and I want to make sure that you do get a chance to give your websites again. Oh, okay. So maybe you could do that for me.
Sure. Okay, sure. So my website's www.living-enlightened.com. And if they want to pre-order the book now, they can do that and make a donation on the Hold On to Hope campaign. They can do that there. And then if you're a business and you'd like to become a sponsor and place an ad in my book, you can go to www.oncethestormisover.com.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to do a couple of things myself, and just hang on and I'll be back to you.
Okay, thanks, John.
For those listening, I want to thank our-truth.com for this broadcast, and you can find more information about me and my book series, The Archangel Jeremiel and the War to Conquer Heaven, at www.john-j-higgins.com, and the website for this radio show is www.hangingwithhiggins.com. So with that, we're ending the broadcast, and thank you for listening.